It's a great pleasure to be here. I guess in part I bring fraternal greetings from British and Scottish social attitude surveys, which NatSense Social Research are responsible for running on the other side of the water, and which have a very similar purpose, etc., to the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey here. And even occasionally we have managed to collaborate with each other on common research projects. So it's a great pleasure to be here to examine and celebrate the 20 years that ARK has brought to our understanding of society, not only in Northern Ireland, but also how Northern Ireland compares with the rest of the United Kingdom. Emma did a lovely job at the beginning of explaining the thesis that I was going to elaborate, so I can save myself a little bit of time. Because the truth is, at least, and I should say here straight away, the use of the word Britain rather than UK in my title is deliberate. I am not going to talk about Northern Ireland. I'm going to leave that into the more than capable hands of Katie. But I am talking about an argument that was used across the UK as a whole, at least in part, as to what devolution would bring, i.e. it would strengthen the union because it would demonstrate that the UK state could respond to the distinctive needs, aspirations and identities of the various parts of the UK. Oh, and by the way, maybe also improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government in the various parts of the UK. But that whether or not that was going to be true or not, whether or not that was going to be achieved, was, shall we say, always something that was argued about. And I suppose most famously, certainly in Scotland, the person who was most critical was Tam Dael, the former Scottish Labour MP, who essentially argued if you create a whole load of new politicians in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, the one thing they'll want to do is to gain more and more power, and you are creating a slippery slope, in his view, towards independence. And certainly one could argue that insofar as, and obviously the position in Northern Ireland is rather different from that in Scotland and Wales, but insofar as, at least in Scotland and in Wales, you are creating institutions which are designed to be symbolic and representative of a distinct national identity that is different from British identity. You could also argue that therefore you were potentially, from a unionist perspective at least, playing with fire. So, how am I going to address that? Well, essentially it's in three parts. Number one is to look at what indeed has happened to identity in the three parts of Great Britain during the course of the last 20 years. Has Britishness been in decline or not? Secondly, I will then move rather closer to the subject matter of the Union, which is, well, how do the various parts of England, Scotland and Wales wish to be governed, and how has that changed in the course of the last 20 years? And above all, trying to address the question, well, therefore, is it the case that the Union has been strengthened, not at least so far as public attitudes are concerned? I should say that in choosing that objective, I'm not declaring myself to unionist. I'm simply taking an objective that some set for devolution in advocating it. And then thirdly and finally, I've kind of used the kind of social science word, mobilising identity. Basically, is it or is it not the case that the link between people's constitutional preferences and their identity, has that changed at all? Is there any evidence, for example, that people in Scotland who feel Scottish are now particularly likely to be in favour of independence as compared with the position 20 years ago? In other words, have we mobilised or politicised identity in such a way that might have undermined the Union? So I'll take each of those three bits as we go, and as you might imagine, within each of those sections there's kind of three bits, because I'm kind of talk about Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland along the way. Anyway, let's start with Scotland. Very occasionally, with some of the stuff about identity, we have the... oh, I see, we're not going forward. Right, sorry, could somebody make sure we're going forward on the slides? No, it's not projecting onto here. That's the problem. So it's working beautifully in front of me.
It looks great, right?
It looks great, yes. Okay, well, I'll carry on in the meantime. So what you should be seeing is a graph that actually demonstrates that you can see... We do have records a few readings of national identity that predate devolution. And obviously, if we're going to talk about what was the impact of devolution on national identity, it's kind of useful to do a before and after. We don't have very many of these readings because the truth is that we tended not to think that this was a question that was worth addressing in social science until basically devolution was beginning to come down the frame. But essentially what we discover certainly that in Scotland we have the very first readings on national identity are back in the 1970s, and at that point it was already the case that if you forced people to choose, more people would say that they were Scottish than to say that they were British, but that the numbers were running around here, around what, between 50 and 60% of people saying that they are British, they're Scottish, and much more a minority saying they're British. But if you now compare that position with where we were at by the time we got to the advent of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, by that stage you were looking at around 3/4 of people who were saying that they were Scottish, and the proportion of people choosing British as their primary identity is down to around the 20% mark. So the truth is that by the time the Scottish Parliament came into play, we were already looking at a society, at least as compared with the 1970s, which is as far back as we can go. Yes, we do want you. As far back as we can go, then the relative strength of British and Scottish identity. So the problem is it doesn't project onto the screen. Okay. All right, I'll carry on. So by the time the Scottish Parliament arrives in 1999, Scotland, frankly, was predominantly and heavily Scottish. And to that extent, at least, one has to accept the Scottish Parliament was certainly a recognition of a change of identity that had already occurred during the course of the previous 20 years or so, and maybe over a longer time frame, but we do not have the data over the longer time frame. Since then, however, relatively little has changed. There was something of an increase in Scottish identity in the immediate period after the creation of the devolved Parliament, but actually one of the intriguing things about the 2014 independence referendum is that in the wake of that, some people in Scotland seemed to rediscover their latent sense of Britishness. And that, if anything now, we tend to only get around 2/3 of people saying, forcing them to choose, I am Scottish, rather than that I am British. And that we've now got the proportion of people who say that they're, wonderful, thank you very much indeed. If we can get that onto slide, perfect, thanks very much, fantastic. Right, you can now see the picture. I've been a radio presenter for the last 2 minutes, trying to paint a picture for you. Right, so as you can see, as we get across here onto the right-hand side, these are the post-independence referendum readings, and you can see that, if anything, actually, the proportion of people, if you force them to choose, who say that they are Scottish, has gone down a bit, and the proportion who say they are British has gone up a bit. Now, of course, those of you who are social scientists in the room will know that this is a relatively crass way of measuring identity, and that one of the somewhat more subtle measures that we have is to, particularly which you can do when basically most people feel one thing or the other, is to the so-called Moreno scale, in which you say to people, are you Scottish, not British, more Scottish than British, or whatever. Now, once you do it that way, very few people in Scotland say that they are more British than they are Scottish. But again, you will notice a society which at the beginning of the devolution, very strong sense of Scottish identity. If anything, it has weakened to some degree, the sense of exclusive Scottish identity. And we've got rather more people now in the last couple of years I've put up here saying that they're equally Scottish and British. So it's certainly very difficult to argue that in Scotland that devolution has undermined British identity. weak though it was in the first place, and weak it certainly was by 1999, though perhaps the event that helped to restore, to some degree at least, the sense of Britishness was an independence referendum that had other consequences to which we will come in a moment. Okay, what about Wales? Now I have to say Wales is the least well endowed of the three parts of Britain insofar as the availability of data on some of these things are concerned. On a few instances here, I've taken the British Social Attitude Survey and I've taken 3 or 4 years of it, and we do ask people about identity, but I'm having to put a lot of people together in Wales from different years to get a picture. But basically, much more straightforward than in Scotland. It's not clear that Welsh identity, which is certainly still, if you force people to choose the more common identity, it is not obvious that it has actually become more so. And a very similar picture if you take the various measures of Merino national identity that have been taken in Wales. So again, at the bottom here are the exclusively Welsh. I mean, there is no time trend here. And lots of people with grey, i.e. they are equally Welsh and British. But what about England? Because certainly quite a few people, including some people in my political science trade, have argued, indeed Michael Kenny's written a very, very long book, a very wide, much praised book, about the apparent rise of English national identity. So what's happened in England? Well, again in England we've got a similar problem to that in Scotland and Wales, but perhaps even more so in spades, which is we do not have very much pre-devolution data. Frankly, until devolution came along, nobody really thought that in a standard social attitude survey or an election study, it was worth bothering asking people in England whether they were English or British. What's the question? Was almost the reaction. And of course, unfortunately, it's often one of the problems with social science is that we only start asking questions about subjects when they're thought to become important, but actually what we really want are measures beforehand. But there we go. Anyway, we do have a little, on the British election study, which I was responsible for running for at that stage, we did start asking people in 1992 about are you English or British as a forced choice question. And as you can see at that point, Britishness definitely outscored Englishness on this relatively crude measure. And it certainly looks as though, on the limited evidence that we have, that during the 1990s, as devolution and the rest of the UK began to come down the track, that Britishness declined and Englishness became more common when people were forced to choose, such that we tended to get the two groups of roughly equal size, though maybe rather more people saying they're British and English. But once we hit 1999, if I just take off the first 3 or 4 readings there, the trend is over. So insofar as there, if indeed, and it is an if indeed devolution helped to make England more English, it was the anticipation thereof rather than the reality that might have been responsible. But intriguingly, despite recent claims about how England's becoming more and more English in its sense of identity, sorry, boring quantitative data does not support thesis. Indeed, if anything, in the most recent British Social Attitude Survey, at 32%, the proportion of people who say that they are English when forced to choose is lower than it has been at any point in the last 20 years. And Moreno gives us much the same picture, because, of course, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why we were asking the question in England is that it was often argued that actually national identity is very fuzzy in England, that people don't really understand the difference between being English and British. Hey, aren't they the same thing, etc., etc. And it's still the case. You can see it predominantly, by far and away the most common answer we get to response to the Moreno question is, I'm both, equally. Why did you bother to ask me? But again, here are the people who say they're exclusively English. Well, you know, it's a bit higher than it was in 1997 when we first asked it, but basically there is no trend here, and it's around, 1 in 7 people in England who will actually deny that they are British, and they are more or less counterbalanced by a similar proportion of people who say they are British and not English, who, by the way, if you're not aware, will be disproportionately people from the BME community, because people from BME communities will tend not to identify as being English for reasons that will become more evident in a while. But it's also because in England, at least, though not necessarily in Scotland or in Wales, Britishness has been sold as the multicultural identity. Okay, and here this is another time series which I put up because this is from the Future of England survey and some other YouGov data, which has sometimes been called upon as evidence that England is getting more and more concerned about its Englishness. Well, sorry, guys, but actually the boring quantitative data, this is from YouGov as opposed to British Social Attitudes, but it tells you basically the same story. So 2 different sources, 2 different survey methodologies, same answer. There doesn't seem to be any change here. So far as identity is concerned, for a stereotypical unionist who are looking at the horizon and what devolution has achieved, the news is relatively good. Yes, devolution did recognise what in Scotland and in Wales at least, though, but not necessarily in England, was a distinctive sense of identity. And insofar as you're going to recognise a distinctive identity which is distributed differently across the different 3 parts of Great Britain, you can see why you might end up with political institutions in Cardiff and in Edinburgh, but not in York or wherever you might wish to put any kind of distinctively English institutions. Though it is in England, but only in England, but only very, very early on in the 1990s that one can come to any evidence that British identity has been undermined. And it's still the case in all 3 parts of Great Britain that lots of people feel equally Scottish, Welsh, English and British. Okay, so far so good for the Union, but yes, you've guessed it, it becomes a bit more complicated when we get to the constitutional question. So let's go back to Scotland. This is a survey question that's been asked on Scottish social attitudes and indeed some earlier surveys really since the SNP took off once again in the mid-1990s. It shows its age. So, for example, we draw the distinction between Scotland being inside the EU and outside the EU. Well, actually, yes, there are SNP folk who are in favour of being independent outside the EU, but it's, so far as political debate's concerned, it's died. More importantly, we have this old-fashioned distinction between the Scottish Parliament having taxation powers and not having taxation powers. When Scotland had its referendum in 1997, Tony Blair insisted that these were 2 separate questions. Got more or less the same answer, but apparently they were 2 separate questions. That's now dead. And this is the one that says we shouldn't have a parliament. For all practical purposes, I'm going to amalgamate the first 2 questions as independence, and I'm going to amalgamate the second 2 as devolution. So, what happens to attitudes towards how Scotland should be governed? You can probably guess, but it's a story that's full of ironies. So, for much of the first 8 years of devolution, when Scottish Parliament was being run by a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition, we had around a quarter to a third of people saying they were in favour of independence. And there were a few people who said we don't want a parliament, but there weren't that many of them. So far, so good. Then, in 2007, the SNP form a minority administration. And they come into power with a very clear ethos. And it read, we think that if we can provide Scotland with effective government, the people of Scotland will respond, thou clearly art wise and wonderful people, O SNP, we will now follow you into the promised land of independence. But actually, paradoxically, here, and even here, after the 2011 Scottish Parliament election, if anything, support for independence seemed to have dropped a wee bit. Maybe, of course, because the SNP administration, unlike its predecessor, felt little restraint in occasionally saying to London, we don't like what we're doing. We think you're wrong. We're going to stand up for Scotland's interest. And that perhaps indeed was exactly what people in Scotland wanted. Not a lovely new Labour partnership between London and Edinburgh, but a bit of grit in the unionist oyster. Anyway, but then of course we had a referendum. And this is the evidence. Unfortunately, we couldn't do a survey last year, but I mean, you'll see, I'll show you further data in a moment. It takes the story forward. The long-term consequence of holding an independence referendum was to result in a very substantial long-term increase and seemingly permanent increase, and so as anything is permanent in life, in support for independence north of the border, making Scotland's membership of the UK clearly highly problematic. Now, if you want to get at something that's a bit more up-to-date in terms of the question that you might ask, here's another question which we don't use the words like independence or devolution or whatever. We just ask people what powers should the Scottish Parliament have or not have. And the point about it is that the option that says that the UK government should decide defence and foreign affairs, but the Scottish Parliament should decide everything else, is meant to be what's in the trade called Devo Max. So it's the idea, or Home Rule. It's basically the idea that Scotland runs everything of its own, and we just allow Westminster to deal with the foreign muck. Okay, so Scotland deals with all the domestic shit, and Westminster does it with the foreign muck. And that was one of the ideas that was being discussed in the Advanced Independence Referendum. So that brings the questions more up to date, but essentially the answers are the same, although you can certainly see very strongly the sense in which Scotland now wants what we might call relative autonomy. So here are the post-independent referendum readings. People saying Scottish Parliament should do everything. It's on the balance, it tends to be higher. Actually, most people think the Scottish Parliament should be pretty much running domestic affairs. What about Wales? Well, in Wales, basically, we've got two time series, but you can put them together and you can get a fairly clear story. Wales, of course, only voted very, very narrowly for devolution back in 1997. Indeed, it was only when the final counting unit was declared that actually the yes majority emerged for the first time on the night. And indeed, again, in this time series of questions being asked on academic surveys, even at this point, 37% saying no assembly, and it's still running at the 20s in the early years of the Welsh Assembly. But gradually, as you can see here, initially the Welsh Assembly, it couldn't do much. It had no primary legislative powers. It now does have them. And here you can see how support for having a much stronger assembly began to grow in the early years of devolution in Wales. And then you've got another time series more recently that comes from ICM. They do a poll every year for the BBC on St David's Day. These are the people who are saying the Welsh Assembly should become more powerful. These are the folk who say we should abolish it, and a few people who say fewer powers. But again, you can see essentially Wales has embraced its assembly, but without, despite a certain amount of chatter at the moment, discernible increase in support for independence. If you ask people directly, should Wales become an independent country, you can get about 20% of people saying that they're in favour. But again, such time series as we have does not actually suggest that the dial has moved. So Scotland, support for the Union undermined, even though devolution is embraced. In Wales, devolution is embraced, but it's not clear that that has undermined support for independence. And then we come to England. And England, shall we say, is a bit of a muddle when it comes to devolution. Because whereas in Scotland and in Wales, it's pretty clear. Do you have a parliament? Do you have an assembly? In England, we start arguing about, well, what kind of devolution do we want? Do we want regional devolution, so some kind of assembly for the North East, for Yorkshire, East Midlands, etc.? Labour tried that. Tried the voters of the northeast of England. They said, no, thank you very much. The more recent Conservative administrations have invented something called city regions, which was essentially, let's have some scale of government, a bit like London, around Manchester, around Liverpool. They have a striking resemblance, for those of you who know your history of English local government, they have a striking resemblance to the metropolitan county councils and the odd county council that Margaret Thatcher took a rather strong dislike to and abolished in 1986. But all of a sudden we seem to have rediscovered Greater Manchester, Merseyside. The boundaries are virtually identical. It's very, very similar. The other thing that has become part of the devolution agenda in England, again at the insistence of the Conservative administration, say, well, you have to have a direct elected mayor to run these new combined authorities and city regions. And they insist on that, although actually in most of the referendums that have been held in England on the subject, people have said no, and it's still highly controversial. Okay. And then meanwhile, of course, the debate in England gets influenced by what's going on north of the border in the wake of the independence referendum, and the idea that maybe Scottish MPs should stop voting on English laws. By the way, your interpretation of the Higher Education Act is, as you might imagine, highly problematic, but I'll talk to you about that afterwards. But it's certainly one of the examples that is cited as to why Scottish MPs should not be allowed to vote on English laws. So, how do we get at this? Well, there are a variety of ways. One is a question, again, that we've kept on asking on British social attitudes on a fairly regular basis, essentially designed to say to people, do you want to carry on with the status quo? Do you want something a bit like Wales, or do you, as it then was back in the 1990s, or do you want something a bit like Scotland? And this is one of those things where you have to ask yourself whether the glass is half full or half empty. On the one hand, it's clear that most people want to keep the status quo. On the other hand, only around a half of people in England want to keep the status quo. And that there's another half or so who are minded to think about either regional assemblies or an English parliament. The trouble is they can't agree about what they want, so therefore the support is fragmented. And equally also, certainly, it isn't clear from this that anything has really changed in the last 20 years. That basically people, half the people in England are happy with the status quo, and it was the same 20 years ago, and it's the same is true now. Somewhat different when we get to the particular question about Scottish MPs voting on English laws, where England, when we started reading it in 2000, I'll come back to that, and always clearly a majority of people saying they agree with it. If you put the blue and the orange together, you get the people who agree, and the people who strongly agree have become more common. So if anything, England's got a bit more exercised about this, okay? Unfortunately, however, and again, this is another example of, I wish some prescient social scientist had thought of this beforehand. We never asked this question before devolution came into place, and we therefore don't know whether this actually is just simply a sentiment, and that maybe even back in 1992, people in England said, what the devil are Scottish MPs doing voting on English laws, which of course they were doing before the advent of devolution. And again, certainly the apparent popularity of evil is underlined by this data from the Future of England survey. If you include evil along with the other options that I showed you earlier, it emerges as the most popular option. But of course, it's not devolution. It's simply changing the rules and the procedures of the House of Commons, which of course has happened to a degree, but it still did not stop Scottish MPs scuppering the liberalisation of the Sunday opening laws in England, even though Scotland has no such laws in the first place. Beautiful irony, but there we go. That's how effective it was. And again, you can also go and then see again the fragmentation. Give people a whole set of options as to what they might, what they want in the way of devolution. Well, the current Conservative government's favoured option in city regions is actually the least popular of all of them, then followed narrowly by regional assemblies, and then, as you can see, basically evil dominates. So again, it's a very, very fragmented view. That said, of course, what might be important about England is not simply what England thinks about itself, but what it thinks about the rest of the UK. And again, sometimes it is argued that there is evidence that England is having a backlash against what's going on in the rest of the UK. Well, one of the daft things we've kept on, and the great thing about being an academic is you can ask daft questions occasionally that you wouldn't dream of putting on a non-academic survey. So occasionally we've asked people in England how we think Scotland should be governed, asking exactly the same question that we've asked people in Scotland. And these are the good folk of England who say, well, if Scotland wants to have its own parliament, fine. No skin off my nose. These are the people who say, could we please get rid of those awkward folk? And arguably, you can argue there are a few more people of that view now than there once were, but there's still basically a distinct minority of people saying they want independence. And indeed, I saw a survey yesterday or the day before underlining the point that the commitment of people in England to keeping Scotland in the Union is a tad stronger than its commitment to keeping Northern Ireland in the Union. But anyway, So that's what we can say about preferences. Essentially, England's fragmented, Scotland's shifted, and really only in Wales can one see devolution embraced in the institutional form it now has, but in such a way that it doesn't undermine the Union. Okay, so, however, the last bit. Identity hasn't changed. Constitutional preferences have changed in Scotland and in Wales, if not necessarily in England. So has the link, therefore, between the two of them changed? Well, this is the data that's got some people exercised in England about English identity, and there is no doubt. This is showing you now attitudes, how people voted in the EU referendum, broken down by identity, both in England and in Scotland. I will come back to Scotland later on, but sure, there is no doubt that people in England who feel English, not British, were much more likely to vote Leave. And to that extent, at least, you look at that and you go, this is some new mobilisation of English identity, which we might therefore wonder whether or not this is also reflected in other attitudes. In contrast, in Scotland, well, there's a bit here at the far end of the very British folk, but that otherwise, basically, there's not a great deal going on. Scottish identity doesn't seem to be reflected in how people vote. However, something that often seems to be forgotten is actually the link between English identity and Euroscepticism, and indeed more broadly, shall we say, a somewhat less liberal attitude towards immigration is nothing new. It has been evident in England for quite a while. This is data back from 2008. Now, you can argue that the link here is a wee bit stronger than it was in 2008, but even in 2008, people who described themselves as wholly or primarily English were more likely to express a sceptical view about the European Union. So that sense of people in England with an English identity being Eurosceptic, it didn't really have to be mobilised. It was already there, ready and waiting to be reflected in the ballot box. And certainly the link is very different when you look at the question as to whether or not how England should be governed. Now, going back to that question I showed you earlier, whether or not people's attitudes towards how England should be governed are different according to their sense of identity. Answer, no. 54% of those people who regard themselves as British want to carry on with the status quo, and 51% of those people who think of themselves as English want to carry on with the status quo. And yes, if you do the trend over time, there is no trend over time. You get a little bit further if you take the question of evil, and here you do begin to some degree to tap into a sense of English identity. But then actually what you'll notice, it's a little bit of a U-shape. The folk who are least keen on evil, and so this is a percentage saying they strongly agree, are actually the folk who feel equally English and British. And there seems to be people on both ends of the spectrum who to some degree say, well, why the hell are the Scottish MPs voting on English laws? But that is about as far as it seems to go. And we certainly cannot read off from the link between English identity and Brexit and the apparent mobilisation, but in my view, just simply continuing mobilisation of English identity as evidence that English identity has also been reawakened so far as how England should be governed. Similar data now for Scotland, looking at Moreno identity. So back in 1999, 44% of those people who said, I am Scottish and I am not British, were in favour of independence. Figure now, 72%. So it's still by no means a perfect relationship. But as you can see, not all, even here, there's a bit of action amongst the people who are primarily British, but there aren't very many of them. But essentially, for the most part, unsurprisingly, the rise in support for independence is concentrated disproportionately amongst those who feel Scottish. So the sense of Scottish identity has not become more common. Indeed, I've shown you that maybe it's become a wee bit less common, but it is now more clearly politicised, more likely to be reflected in support for wanting to leave the United Kingdom. Oops. And Wales, equally, identity has been politicised. The folk who wish to abolish the Assembly are by the most part primarily amongst those who say they are more or only British. The folk who want either independence or more powers are predominantly those who feel wholly or primarily Welsh. So in contrast to England, both in Scotland and in Wales, identity is politicised, it is reflected in people's constitutional preferences, and in Scotland, but not in Wales, that has become more clearly the case. So that leaves me with one final twist to the Scottish story, something again Emma also mentioned. So I've already shown you that Scotland, in the wake of the independence referendum, became much more divided on the question of its constitutional preference, mobilising Scottish identity, and that there's not that much of a link between Scottish identity and how people voted on Brexit. But Brexit, of course, we know has created its own sense of identity. Many people feel very strongly Remain, very people feel very strongly Leave. So here's another possible identity that might also affect people's attitudes towards staying inside the UK. So, very briefly, what's happened in Scotland in the wake of Brexit? And again, it's another story where social science tells you something that you would not guess from journalism. Sorry, Emma, I'm not being nasty, but this is one of those areas where arguably we bring something to the table. So those of you who are following the 2014 Scottish independence referendum at all will remember that we had an endless argument about whether or not an independent Scotland would or would not be a continuing member of the European Union. It was almost as intense as the argument about the Northern Ireland backstop, but arguably the argument about the Northern Ireland backstop defeated it. Anyway, the irony is that back in 2014, whether or not you were a Eurosceptic or a Europhile made no difference to your probability of being in favour of independence. So here's the position in 2013 before, and this is also pre the referendum. Basically, Eurosceptics and Europhiles were equally likely to vote for yes. And the nationalist movement in Scotland has always had an element within it whose view has basically been, what's the point of liberating ourselves from London only to put ourselves into chains with Brussels? But as you will notice, as we get to after the EU referendum, all of a sudden we start to emerge with those people who want the European Union at least to remain as strong as it is, maybe become even stronger, being much more likely to say yes than those who voted no. And what essentially was going on here for a while was a resorting of, so the level of support for independence was not dramatically changing. It was still running at 45% in the wake of the EU referendum, but Remain voters, some of them were switching from no to yes, and some yes voters were switching in the opposite direction who had voted Leave. Net effect zero, but the character of support for independence was changing. And if you now take the polling data more recently, you can see how that process has continued yet further. So even by last year, the polls on average were showing 50% of Remainers in favour of independence, only around a third of Leavers. That gap has widened. These are the most recent polls in Scotland done very close to Brexit Day. And essentially, as you can see, all of the growth in support for independence, which has been registered in the last 12 months. And the polls in the last 12 months in Scotland have shown support for independence going up. That's what you can see here. So this is no, this is yes, and as you can see, they've converged. We're essentially now at roughly the 50-50 point. But that increase, is here. It's amongst Remain voters. So initially what was simply a resorting exercise is now become an asymmetric one. So more Remain folk have gone from no to yes than Leave folk have gone from yes to no. Ergo, Brexit has added a new twist to the story in Scotland. So, what should we conclude? Well, on mobilising identity, basically devolution in Scotland and Wales has mobilised identity, but then in Scotland, independence has come on to mobilise identity. In England, however, it hasn't. And so the conclusion, therefore, I think we have to draw about devolution is different in the three parts of Britain. Arguably, in Wales, the unionist vision has been realised. The devolution institutions are accepted, they've been embraced. Yep, sure, people want a few more powers, but there isn't any discernible evidence that has resulted in any undermining in a wish to remain inside the UK. In England, in contrast, however, the debate remains fragmented. It isn't clearly linked to identity. People cannot agree about what they want, if indeed they want anything. And that therefore, as a result, certainly the idea that devolution might be a way of delivering more efficient and more effective government is certainly something still that is not clear that public opinion in England has embraced. But it is in Scotland where the question marks about the success of the devolution project clearly now rest. In creating the Scottish Parliament, inadvertently, unionism created an environment in which the SNP were able to prosper and eventually were able to hold a referendum, the purpose of which, from a unionist perspective, was to destroy the SNP, but all it simply did was to ensure that Scotland's membership of the Union became more problematic than it had been arguably since 1707, and then Brexit has added a new twist that now means that nobody knows what would happen if Scotland were to have another referendum, which maybe is one of the reasons why the current Prime Minister is none too keen on the idea.